All right. Hey, my friends, and welcome to another episode of the Restored Mind Show. In this episode, we're going to be talking about anxiety and resistance. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Matt Codde, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker in California, and I specialize in working with OCD and anxiety. And on this episode, right, I want to continue our series that we've been talking about for the past few weeks on the coronavirus and anxiety, and more importantly, just this question of how do we best manage ourselves as individuals during this time, right? Because the reality is that when we look at this situation, right? When we look back on this situation, like we are going to emerge through this, like that just will happen, right? This will pass. And how we go through it, though, is going to be determined not from a country or a state or a county level, but it's as individuals, right? Because if we can manage this well as an individual, meaning you, like personally, and then you can manage it well in your relationship, whether you're significant other, your families, and then as family units, and then as we move on to extended families and social circles and organizations, and then we move up, we work as individuals. We have to work at this from an individual level. And yes, we want to take the precautions we can to prevent the spread as individuals, but we also want to talk about how are we managing it as individuals just internally, right? Because there's all these new things and struggles that we're being presented with on a day by day basis. And managing that can be overwhelming. And so that's really what, this particular series is about, is just managing ourselves well during this crisis. And so I wanted to talk about really just one word today. And it's the word resistance. And so much of our struggle in life comes back down to this idea of resisting what has happened or what is happening. And resistance, if you just think about it, it's just this idea of like an unwillingness to accept or comply with what is, right? It's like I'm resisting, right? I'm going against something, right? And oftentimes we're talking about like the present moment in that situation, right? And yes, there are situations that I'm not going to like obviously when it comes down to basic needs and stuff like that. Yes, like we need to be getting people help and health and their basic needs and all of that. I totally agree with that. But what I'm talking about here is more on an emotional level, right? And how we're going to be managing this like from an emotional standpoint from within ourselves. Because things like social isolation and, stay-at-home orders and self-quarantines, these are new things that we're having to encounter. And the thing is the first point that I want to talk about is when we resist something, what we're doing is we essentially add another layer of pain to that particular problem, right? So let's just take the instance of the pandemic itself, of this coronavirus pandemic. When we resist the idea that we're in a pandemic, right? Meaning like we get upset that we're in a pandemic, that doesn't help anything, right? It really doesn't. It just makes us angry or frustrated that we're experiencing this problem, right? It's I often use like an analogy of if I got stranded on a desert island, right, in a plane crash, and I was angry that I was stranded, like that literally does nothing for me. Right? Now, not only I have to deal with being stranded, but I also have to deal with being angry about being stranded, right? And when we resist something, we add that pain. And the reason we resist something is because we think we know the way something should be, right? And this word should is really kind of the second point I want to talk about, right? Is this the idea that resistance, adds pain to the issue and adds a whole nother layer of problems. But this word should, right? So much of our suffering and pain in life comes from this word should, right? And it's this idea that we believe we know how life should be, and because it's not that way, then we get upset, right? And the reality is that there is no way things should be, right? Like we can talk about this alternative universe, and I guess, things could have happened this way or that way. But at the end of the day, there's just what is, right? Like we are in the middle of a pandemic. There is no changing that. right? There's just how we manage it, right? And that's why this series is so so important for me. It's like it is, and again, as an individual as well, like I need to focus on how I manage this, myself. And the more and more we all do that, the better we'll emerge through it. Because when we resist it and fight against what we're experiencing, right? And being upset that we're experiencing this, it doesn't help anything, right? All it does is just create an emotional chaos with the situation, right? And that word should is just a very, just to be cautious, right? Of that word should in your mind, like how often it's coming up. Oh, well, I shouldn't have to be quarantined. Well, you know what? We are, right? And that's just what is. And, for many people lost their jobs. And again, that word should comes in, like, I shouldn't have lost my job. It's like, well, if that happened, then it happened. And it's not that I'm happy about that or anything like that. It's obviously, it's a bad situation, but being upset that the situation happened doesn't help us improve it, right? And when we actually remove that resistance and move into acceptance of what's happened, we can start focusing on solving it from there, right? And it's not that we're not experiencing problems, right? It's what I'm really talking about today is just this idea of resisting the problems that we're currently experiencing. Okay, because it just adds fuel to that fire, and in an unnecessary way in many cases. And so because many of us practice what I call conditional acceptance, right? Like, I'm willing to accept this if it's this, right? We have these conditions that it meets. And if you think about that, like, that's just not it's just not a practical way to live, right? I mean, imagine if your spouse said that to you, or, if you're a parent, like if you had conditional acceptance over your child, right? Like, I'm only going to accept you if you get straight A's or things like that. It's like, if we think about that, it's a ridiculous way, because true acceptance is just that. It's accepting. It's a willingness not to try to change the situation that currently is. Right. And to say, and so many people will say that when it comes to anxiety, right? And that's really what I want to talk about as well, is that resistance to anxiety. And when we resist anxiety, what happens is that the anxiety surfaces and we resist it, and we aren't willing to experience it, and we try to shun it away, and we do these, different behaviors to try to remove it, and it ends up trapping us in these loops, right? And one of the reasons is just because we're not willing to experience it, right? We're resisting anxiety. So when people talk about like, hey, well, how, Matt, how do I accept certain thoughts, right? Or how do I accept, feeling anxious, right? Like, it's this thing that we do. And when you think about real acceptance actually isn't a verb. It's not something you do. It's actually not doing anything, right? It's being willing to kind of surrender and say, okay, that is what it is, right? And if you were to ask, how do you accept your child unconditionally or your spouse unconditionally, they don't have to change, right? And when we talk about acceptance of the situation, I'm not saying that we need to like the situation that we're in. This is a very difficult time, and the struggles people, everyone is experiencing are very real. Okay. And it's tough, and it's hard, and it's chaotic, and rules are changing every day, and all this uncertainty that emerges, it's a very difficult thing to manage. And all I'm trying to say is, as we manage it as ourselves, as individuals, when we resist what is and what's currently happening, we're adding more fuel and more problems for ourselves to deal with. Okay. And hopefully that makes sense. And again, when we're talking about acceptance and things like that, this doesn't apply to like basic needs. Look, like, of course, I'm not telling you if you like are don't have money for food, you just need to accept that. That's not what I'm saying. Okay. Like, we're talking strictly on like an emotional level right here, and how to manage ourselves emotionally during this time, right? Obviously, basic needs don't apply to this, right? People need to have their basic needs met. But it's just that idea of when the feelings surface, or when the anger surfaces, or when the anxiety surfaces, right? A lot of that stuff is caused by our resistance to what is. And the more and more we can accept what's going on and not think that there's a way it should be, but just being willing to accept, okay, here's what's happening, the better we're being, the less emotional the stress we add to that situation, and we're able to use our brain to, for solution focused ways, as opposed to getting lost in all the emotion of that situation being present. So, and I hope I'm communicating that well, because it's just it's such an important concept. And really during this time, one of the things that we can really be doing is practicing this idea of self-mastery, of not allowing our external environment to disrupt us internally to the point where we're just out of control, right? And I started off this series when I was saying, when I was watching people in the store, like, knock people over, because they're grabbing, vegetables or, toilet paper, right? It's like bumping into people and being just totally out of line at just grocery stores, right? And that's not a reflection of the individual. That's a reflection of the individual just being overtaken by emotion. And as individuals, we can actually practice and develop a level of self-mastery by realizing what we're experiencing, right? And more importantly, being accepting for what is happening and addressing those problems head on, as opposed to being resistant that the problems themselves are existing, And that level of self-mastery can come in, when we start to accept the problems and then use our mind to actually focus on solving the problems themselves, as opposed to getting lost in our mind and our thoughts and our emotions about having to deal with those problems, right? And so, to quickly recap, the things I wanted to talk about really is just this idea of resistance, and that how resistance adds another layer of pain to most situations. And then we talked about, obviously, the word should, and how in many ways that word is kind of the cause of a lot of turmoil in people's lives, right? Because it assumes that how things are supposed to be, and because it's not that way, there's an immediate resistance and frustration to what is, right? And the reality is, there is no should. There's just how it is. And instead of practicing conditional acceptance and thinking that the world needs to be a certain way for you to be okay, asking yourself, like, how can I practice being okay with however the world is? Because what that will do is to make you a more balanced person internally, which again will make you, see things clearer and be able to make better decisions in your day-to-day life, and ultimately as an individual, and then as a family unit, and then so on and so forth as we move through this together. So, hopefully I was helpful, and I just encourage you this week just to ask those questions, like, what am I resisting that's actually making this problem worse? And two, like, how can I practice being more unconditionally accepting of things that are beyond my control, so that I'm okay internally as an individual. And for those of you that are struggling, during this time, and anxiety is getting really heavy again, we have our Overcoming Anxiety program open up. So we have weekly groups. We also have our masterclass, and you can find that over at restoredminds.com. We also have free resources available for download as well. And assessments, things like that, to help you on your journey. So, and again, I'll have some links down in the notes where you can get access to that. And again, I just want to thank you all and encourage you all as we go through this together. Just take it day at a time. Just take it one day at a time, because if we are able to just handle today, we can handle tomorrow. And eventually, if we just keep putting one foot in front of the other, we'll get through this, not only as individuals, but as families, as organizations, as states and countries, and eventually the world. So thank you all. I wish you a happy Easter for those of you who celebrate Easter, and hope you guys have a great week. And I'll see you guys next week as we continue on with the series. Bye.